Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the USA, where I'm visiting each state and exploring everything from their strange history to their haunted places. Today we're visiting Southern California, which I know it isn't a state, but California is so large it needs to get split up. And we're going to talk about everything from a haunted taco shop bathroom to cemeteries for pets, where they say old Fido is still playing fetch. Now, if you want to see more videos like this for every state in the USA, they will always be free. And all you've got to do to support me is like this video, hype it, comment, and subscribe if you want to be alerted to what comes next. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With that being said, let's explore some of Southern California's weirdest lore. Before making this video, I figured there would be a few places that made me think, yep, only in Los Angeles. And when I stumbled upon this cemetery for pets only to find it was actually only the second largest in the county, that definitely cemented that feeling. This pet cemetery, which is distinctly not cursed by a Wendigo like the one in that Stephen King novel he wrote about, is run in modern day by one Shara Denise Folk. And while you'd think a cemetery for pets, small creatures we usually bury in our backyard, might be a slow gig, according to interviews you can find online, they are absolutely slammed with business. And upon opening on Mondays, mourners the state across will pour through their doors, trying to get their little fluffy friends memorialized. And thus, the owners and operators will take them around the 10-acre property, showing them the variety of places where Rex, Fluffy, Chewy, or whatever else you've named your dog, cat, gerbil, or horse can be placed for their final rest, with them showing off everything from their tiny gravestones to rodent-sized holes that can suit your own personal needs. Also, as you might expect, the clients here aren't your typical working-class LA families. I mean, those clients do exist, but this cemetery in particular has a reputation for being home to the animals of celebrities and show animals, with one of the most famous entries here, for instance, being an actual MGM lion, who is fittingly buried beside the animal that was his best friend in life, a common house cat. The allure of burying your pet here actually does make a lot of sense though, for all the shade I'm throwing at it. I mean, sure, you could bury your pet on private land, but when you move, well, you're probably going to end up leaving it behind there, and there the new owners, they might dig it up, destroy, or possibly even pave over your pet. And let's be real, you don't want that. Thus, this place offers services that range in price from tens to thousands of dollars to memorialize your pet on their land forever. And as funny as it is, while there is a bit of a trend with the filthy rich burying their pets here, while I am not filthy rich at all, I can absolutely empathize with having as much respect for a dog or cat as you would for your fellow man. And perhaps it's this feeling that makes it feel so appropriate that, like us, the pets that were laid to rest here might supposedly have found a way to live on after death. To put it lightly, some folks that visit here after hours claim they see miraculous things. For instance, they say that if you're the type of person liable to see a ghost or two, this place might look like a darn dog park with dogs running around playing with one another, or possibly a farm with all of the phantom horses running about. And it's not just random dogs and cats either. There are some famous and recurring entries too. For instance, in addition to those MGM lions I mentioned, the most famous and often seen ghost is the dog of Rudolph Valentino, a Doberman that passed away in 1929 but is still occasionally seen appearing near his grave here. There are even reports that he's given out puppy kisses to visitors. Seriously, there are accounts online of folks seeing a loose dog in the park, calling it up to them, petting it, and getting a few kisses, and being like, "Hey buddy, where's your owner?" only to look back and see this dog has disappeared completely. Also, sometimes barking and panting can be heard near this grave, followed by a little phantom lick on your calf. If you do see him, his name is Kabar, and I'm pretty sure he'd like a pet. This dog was also, funny as it is, seen in Valentino's mansion back in 1948 by a group of spiritualists gathered to celebrate Valentino's birthday after he passed on. And then afterwards, he'd disappear, jumping out of a closed window, perhaps retreating back to this very graveyard. Also famous is LA Room 8. Yes, I didn't just go full AI narrator mode and skip stories. LA Room 8 is seriously the name of a pet. It's a cat who lived his days in Room 8 of Elysian Heights Elementary School in Echo Park, California, from 1952 until he passed on in 1968. He lived in the school and even took summers off like the kids, and eventually he was taken in by a local family in his later years who would actually drop him off at school in the morning and pick him up in the evening. He even had the honor of getting a book written about him and getting 3 columns in the Los Angeles Times as an obituary when he passed away. This tri-colored cat is often seen doing, well, cat stuff all around the cemetery. And if you see nothing but feel something rub up against your leg, it's said that you might have just been visited by old Room 8. Tacolita is a simple taco spot just east of Pasadena and Arcadia. Looking this place up, it seems like the reviews are actually pretty favorable, and that scores of people in LA went here throughout their lives. Seriously, just looking it up, it doesn't seem conspicuous at all, but if you do a bit more digging, you'll find that this place has the strange accolade of the world's most haunted taco shop, or possibly the most haunted taco shop in California. Now, I know that Taco Bell bathrooms are pretty scary, but personally I do have to wonder if this haunted taco shop list is greater than 1 total. Regardless, they say it's true, so let's dive in. As for any history here, well, I mean, it's a taco shop, it's pretty modern, so it hardly has any, so I don't need to get into that. Further, there's nothing particularly violent that's ever been widely documented to have occurred on this lot to attribute this haunting to, so where this haunting comes from, it kind of beats me. As for the haunting itself though, well, it's written about quite a bit, and it's pretty scary stuff. They say that inside of, or in relation to the bathroom at Tacolita's, there is a recurring ghost. Most often, this apparition is simple. They say a tall man in khaki pants, wearing a yellow sweater up top, will go into the restroom, which is located around back of the taco joint. Usually, they describe him as old and walking with a bit of a limp, and sometimes he'll even walk by the windows, smile at the patrons, and show them his teeth, which are actually just gaps in his teeth, and cockroaches fly out. It's scary stuff. As for the best personal story I found, though, it was by a woman named Tamara Thorne, who shared her story with the San Gabriel Tribune. Tamara said that she and her husband stopped by Tacolita, I quote, with plans to use the restroom. In other words, they weren't going to eat, they were going to unload here, and things must have been dire. Regardless, her husband would see a man walk into the restroom before him, and he'd wait outside for him to finish. And after a while, I mean, if you're stopped at a taco shop to use the restroom out back, you're gonna be in dire straits. So he knocked on the door to ask if the man was okay, only to then go on to open the restroom door and find the lights were off and the room was empty. And the scariest part of this account is the poor guy, after realizing the restroom was haunted, still used it. As I said, dire circumstances. Regardless, even if this is the funniest account, there are more of them out there, and he wasn't the only one to see this strange man. Either way though, despite being haunted, this place has 4.4 stars on Google, which I think is indisputably near the perfect amount of stars, though 3.5 stars on Yelp is a little bit scary if you ask me. Anyways, let me know, should I visit Tacolita next time I'm in LA? I'm there quite a bit for family reasons, and I'd love to see if I can catch a ghost there myself, and maybe I'll even use the restroom. The Point Loma Lighthouse was originally commissioned to be built by the government right after California's annexation in 1850. The reason it was needed was that after the Mexican-American War, the USA acquired a ton of land on the Pacific coast, and thus people began to migrate west to California for this new land, a migration that was only bolstered when gold was discovered all over California. Thus, with all of this travel and looming trade, lighthouses were commissioned in the 1850s to accommodate these new settlers and prospectors. But most importantly, the supply ships headed to the Pacific coast. Thus, Congress doled out $90,000, about $4 million today, to construct lighthouses up and down the coast. In 1855, this lighthouse was therefore completed and put in operation. That said, it had a reputation for being a bit of a, let's say, problem child. See, it was so tall, at 422 feet, that it was the tallest lighthouse in the USA at the time, which at first you'd think was a good thing, but it meant that low clouds and fog would obscure it, a decided disadvantage. That said, it could also sometimes be seen from far away, which in some ways was a good thing, but this was also said to confuse sailors as to where they actually were relative to the coast. Now, because of this confusing nature, I found it cited that lighthouse keepers, when they saw this ship, would actually sometimes signal them by, I kid you not, just starting to shoot their shotguns off into the air to try to orient the sailors better. Now, regardless of the fact that this lighthouse seemed to do about as much bad as good, this light would shine for the next 36 years. And in 1891, it would be replaced with the new Point Loma lighthouse, extinguishing the old one for now and leaving it in a pretty worse-for-wear state. It was even almost torn down to be replaced with a statue of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, but luckily this didn't happen, and it was eventually given over to the National Parks Service in the 1930s and restored. It also got a bit of new life in World War II when it was camouflaged and briefly made into a signal tower for ships coming into the San Diego harbor. Today, though, the lighthouse doesn't play any pivotal role. It's just a museum, and visitors can see what a lighthouse was like in the 1800s. That's all, end of the story. Just kidding, it's haunted as all get out. The most common variety of hauntings here are auditory ones. People claim to hear loud footsteps coming from the second floor, and sometimes, as they stand at the top and peer out towards the coast, they say they hear labored breathing. Further, those who've come here at night sometimes claim that strange moaning sounds, sort of like noises that a human couldn't make, that are sort of demonic, can be heard coming from the bedrooms, which is pretty phasmophobia of that ghost. One visitor was even climbing up the stairs to the light and heard a moan, which, with each of their steps, got louder and more persistent. And then, when they got to the top, because they kept going to the top for some reason despite an unearthly moan, it became frigid, and they observed a shadowy apparition appear in front of them, before it rapidly flew down the stairs through them. They, for some reason, think that this guy is Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, the Iberian explorer who explored the American West Coast, which was never in this lighthouse. Alrighty then. More logically, though, some others say it's Robert Decatur Israel, the last lighthouse keeper here, although some speculate the ongoing haunting could be related to the Point Loma Rosecrans National Cemetery, which is just about a mile away. The area that is today Joshua Tree National Park was, beforehand, the land of the native people of the region for thousands of years. I guess like all of the land in America. Tribes like the Serrano, the Chemehuevi, and the Cahuilla people were experts of living in this harsh climate, and they would harvest plants like mesquite and yucca, hunt scarce desert game, and even established trade routes across the Mojave and Colorado deserts. Today, because of this, while Joshua Tree has plenty of supposedly haunted places created by white settlers, you'll also find ancient rock art, old shelters, and artifacts dotting the landscape. And some say that in general, Joshua Tree is haunted because of that. For instance, in my research for this video, I saw accounts of folks camping in a storm on Eagle Mountain, and they heard footsteps circling their tent in the hard rain and loud thunder, only to find that by morning there was no trace, no prints or anything around their tent. Folks have also reported that while hiking and camping here at night, one might be liable to see dancing lights in the hills, or to hear the sounds of people humming and singing, and to see dim campfires with shadowy figures dancing around them in the distance that, when approached, seem to fade away from our plane of reality. Of course, a few hundred years ago, this native landscape changed though, and in the 18th century, the Spanish missionaries and explorers would arrive, and they would make their mark on the landscape, and in the 19th and 20th century, they would be followed by miners, cattle ranchers, and homesteaders, drawn by the promise of gold, grazing, and land offered by the Homestead Act. Evidence of this period can be seen in places like Joshua Tree's Lost Horse Mine. This mine was originally created in the 1890s by one Johnny Lang, who developed the mine and a 2-stamp mill to process gold mined underground here. This gold's existence would be made known to him by one Dutch Frank, who actually discovered the gold but opted not to mine it himself because there were cattle rustlers nearby at the modern Keys Desert Queen Ranch. Johnny Lang, however, was braver, and with a few partners, he'd take his chances on the gold mine. This mine would later become the property of a Montana rancher named J.D. Ryan, who bought the mine from Johnny, keeping him employed there, and he'd update this operation, running a water pipeline from over 3 miles away to help power a steam-powered 10-stamp mill here. This mine would produce gold until 1905, at which point, in their digging, they'd run into a fault line, and the gold would disappear along with this moving earth. Around this time, there was also a bit of conspiracy too. See, Ryan, the new owner, was suspicious of the lack of gold his investment was producing, and apparently he discovered that the old owner, Lang, was actually stashing away about half of the gold the mine produced. Lang, of course, was fired, but as the story goes, he'd come back for his gold before moving out to an area we now refer to as Johnny Lang Canyon for a while, and that when the Lost Horse mine was abandoned, he returned, living here again for a while, until his health declined. Nowadays, of course, this mine is said to be mighty haunted. To start, they say that while the mine was in operation, there were a handful of accidents here. Some people got crushed, others succumbed to noxious underground gases. Now, there's no head count necessarily on the total that passed here, but they say whoever these folks were, you might occasionally, especially at night, hear echoes faintly coming from underground that sound like yelling and pleading for assistance. Further, cold breezes, even on hot days, are often felt here, and sometimes, even today, you can feel vibrations on your feet that almost feel like, not so far below you, someone might be hitting a rock with a pickaxe. Of course, among these spirits, it's said that Johnny Lang still dwells here too. Just like he stole and stashed gold in life, he's decided to protect it in the afterlife. I've seen a select few sources claiming that Johnny's gold, too, is still out there, and that if you see an old man with a bald head and a thick mustache that's wearing overalls wandering the hills near this mine, well, you might be closer to this gold and to Johnny than you'd expect. Further, as you might expect, it's not just mines and Native American spirits haunting Joshua Tree. There's also the famous Joshua Tree Inn. The Joshua Tree Inn, built in 1949, is a Spanish colonial-style motel located in Joshua Tree, California. Originally, this place was a stopover for travelers headed to and from the desert. Over time, though, it gained cultural significance as a retreat for musicians and artists that were drawn to the area's solitude and beauty. And among these famous visitors, one stands head and shoulders above the rest, a country rock icon named Graham Parsons, a visitor who passed away in this very motel. As for some history on Graham, well, he passed away in room 8 of this hotel on September 19th of 1973. Graham, to put it lightly, was a famous musician for the brief time he spent on this earth, and even as a teenager, he was talented enough to perform in clubs owned by his adopted father. That said, Graham, like many musicians of the 60s and 70s, struggled with, let's say, substances, and one of his favorite places to indulge in those, and in musical mayhem, was in this very inn, and in Joshua Tree National Park in general. Here, to put it lightly, he would travel with his friends and do everything from meditate and play his guitar to go on, trips, and not the type of trips you'd take in a car, if you catch my drift. And while on these trips, he claimed he encountered everything from UFOs to spirits of the natives of the land, which, hey, I mean, if I was Stony Baloney and rocking off my balls, I'd probably see some crazy stuff too. Though, to be fair, plenty of sober people have seen this stuff in Joshua Tree too from my reading. His final visit to Joshua Tree occurred after his home burnt down, after which he lost everything except his guitar and his Jaguar. Thus, he decided to visit Joshua Tree to heal, I say in quotes, with some of his friends. And I say heal in quotes because what he did was very destructive. On the last night of his life, Graham would indulge in some, let's say, fermented agave plant, and he'd consult with some locals too to buy some stuff that you'd normally reserve use of for long, painful hospital stays. And this concoction proved to be a little too much for him. And this evening, he would pass away. And then, days later, in one final act, one of Graham's friends would essentially steal his body from the morgue where it was kept and set it aflame near Cap Rock, a special place for Graham where he'd mentioned when he passed he'd like his ashes spread. Thus, if you couldn't already guess, Graham absolutely haunts this old hotel. And the most haunted place is fittingly his favorite room in the place. Room 8, which to be clear is not the room 8 where the cat was in the prior story. Here they say doors will open and close, refuse to remain locked, and that there's a mirror that's said to be the one that Graham last saw his reflection in, and that because of that it rattles in the night. Further, those that visit and try to record EVPs often capture the voice of who they believe to be Graham Parsons. This voice is sometimes singing, but usually it's just speaking. Funny enough, and maybe this is a rumor, but I found it listed in multiple places, that it's actually a policy that housekeepers must carry their phones while they clean Graham's room, because it's so often known to lock and unlock itself in a manner that the maids are unable to escape. There's also Room 9, Emmylou Harris's room, who was one of Graham Parsons' musical colleagues, not a lover like some say, at least according to them, which is right next to Room 8. Again, Graham Parsons' favorite room. While my impression is this room isn't haunted itself, guests staying in this room have reported to have been woken up in the middle of the night by loud music coming, of course, from the adjacent Room 8. This music will, according to witnesses, start loud, but get quieter over the course of a few minutes before gradually fading away. It sounds like Graham is still writing music in the afterlife to me. I'm sure when we make it there, he'll have some bangers written for us, so that's encouraging, I guess. Then there's a ghost that, from what I can tell, isn't named or labeled, but they say in Room 10, guests have reported to feel, well, how do I put this? Held down to the bed. The spirit here seems to be a bit of a, horny boy. You know, like the TCU horned frogs. Nothing dirty or anything. Further, I found a weird report from US Ghost that one of their cast members actually reportedly saw a short, dark figure that, according to him, looked a lot like Cousin It from the Addams Family in Room 11. This creature, or whatever it was, felt hostile to this cast member, but of course he didn't catch it on video, because you never do. They speculated that it might be the spirit of a photographer killed by a drunk driver in the motel's parking lot on September 17th of 2009. So, cool stuff. There's a small, hairy, and possibly inhuman entity in that room. I'm definitely not going to stay in that one. Anyways, let me know. Are there more haunted places in Joshua Tree? If I'm missing a lot here, I'd be willing to make an entire Dark Places video covering Joshua Tree, and adding that to my list of national parks that I've covered. I'm not normally one for nautical stuff beyond my inflatable paddleboard, but I do have an admission. I love old ships, and I find it fascinating that just a century ago, rather than jumping aboard planes, we circumnavigated the globe traveling on water. Thus, the Star of India is one of the coolest landmarks I've personally visited on this list. This ship is a famous iron-hulled sailing ship that was built in 1863 that lives on today as a museum ship in San Diego. It's the oldest, still regularly sailing ship in the entire world. This ship was originally launched in the United Kingdom from the Isle of Man as the full-rigged Euterpe, and it was an early experiment in iron shipbuilding. Now, as you might expect with an early nautical experiment, her first voyages were nothing short of disasters. She collided with another ship, suffered a mutiny, was caught in a cyclone that bent her topmasts, and she even lost her first captain at sea. Nasty stuff. But despite this, she surprisingly would still have a relatively long career carrying cargo and passengers the world across. In 1871, she was then sold to carry immigrants to New Zealand, completing 21 circumnavigations of the world on this route. And in her younger days, she sometimes carried coal or canned salmon as far as California and Chile. Then, in 1901, she joined the Alaska Packers fleet, was re-rigged as a bark, and renamed her modern name, the Star of India. All of this said, in 1923, steamships had taken over, so she was retired, and in 1926, San Diego citizens purchased the old vessel, raising about $9,000 and using it to tow her to the harbor to preserve her. However, the Depression and World War II put any restoration efforts on hold until the 1950s, when Captain Alan Villiers led restorations. By 1976, the Star of India had been rebuilt and returned to sea, and today she houses exhibits at the San Diego Maritime Museum and is actively maintained by a team of volunteers. According to the museum's own history, she sails at least once a year, usually under a skilled volunteer crew, and as I said, she's the oldest ship that's still sailing regularly in the entire world, which might be a technicality, but is still kind of cool. Now, with over 150 years of hard, dangerous service at sea, it's not a surprise that the Star of India has a reputation for being a little bit haunted. Tour guides and local lore are abound with ghost stories tied to the ship's tragic past. The museum even hosts an October Haunted Star Tales event each Halloween season to highlight these spooky legends surrounding this ship. Visitors and staff have reported eerie sensations, unexplained noises, cold spots, and phantom figures, especially in places where sailors once passed on. Now, as for specific ghost stories on this ship, there are actually quite a few. To start, there's a story that in 1909, a Chinese crewman was killed in the room where the anchor chain is stowed, because the winch was started erroneously, leading to the chain crushing him before anyone could hear him yelling for help. Thus, in this room, there are cold spots that are said to be frequent, and sometimes folks feel their arms and ankles grabbed, as if this man is reaching out for help that never came his way in life. There's also a supposed apparition of a young boy that calls this ship his eternal home. As the story goes, in 1884, a 14-year-old boy named John Campbell stowed away on what was then the Euterpe. Of course, he was caught, but instead of punishing the young man, the captain let him stay aboard as an apprentice. Sadly, though, this didn't last long. While aloft on the rigging, it's said that John lost his grip and fell nearly 100 feet to the deck below, passing away from these injuries days later aboard the ship. Thus, today, while visitors walk the deck of the ship or explore the crew quarters, they sometimes have reported briefly seeing a young boy in sailing clothes, or, of course, feeling a cold hand brush against them, near where he fell. And finally, there's of course plenty of other activity without a name or a face attached to it. And it manifests in really fun ways. See, there's something fun that goes on here where overnight school trips are often held below deck in the ship's living areas. During these trips, though, strange things have been reported, such as in one instance where a teacher, who was sleeping in the first mate's cabin, woke up when her blanket was violently ripped off the bed and she was suddenly assaulted by an ice-cold chill in the air. Other visitors in these quarters have reported faint footsteps, disembodied voices, and of course the feeling of being watched in the crew's berths and corridor, as if the spirits of these long-dead sailors were still keeping a midnight watch. Anyhow, whether you believe in ghosts or not, the real history of the Iron Lady of the Seas, as she was once called, is remarkable on its own. That said, if you do feel something cold and eerie below the decks, it's probably just the crew from hundreds of years ago paying you a quick hello. Nothing too scary. And of course, with the Viper Room, we're going to start our discussion of places that were featured in the late BuzzFeed Unsolved, perhaps the best show ever to grace YouTube. This notorious building at 8852 Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood dates back to 1921, when it was nothing more than a small neighborhood grocery store, catering to the growing local community during its early years of Sunset Strip development. By the 1940s, however, the grocery had given way to nightlife, and the property entered a long lineage of Sunset Boulevard clubs. It was first the Cotton Club, unrelated to Harlem's famous venue, a modest attempt to borrow the glamour of the East Coast jazz culture and bring it west, though on a smaller and more local scale. It later cycled through names like Greenwich Village Inn and Rue Angel, both of which tried to evoke bohemian or cosmopolitan themes, and signaling how the Strip was becoming a cultural crossroads. Then, from 1951 to 1969, the space found its longest-lasting identity as the Melody Room, which was sometimes called the Melody Lounge, a cabaret of sorts that was infamous not only for its live music, but also for its gangster clientele. For instance, Mickey Cohen and his Los Angeles crime syndicate were regulars, giving the club a dangerous allure. For performers, it was basically a chance at visibility and a brush with the underworld, and for patrons, it was a place where Hollywood glamour mixed kind of unwell with organized crime. By the 1970s, though, the counterculture had shifted the Strip's identity, and the club re-emerged as, my favorite name at least, Filthy McNasty's, a rock venue aligned with the era's rebellious spirit that was known to host a younger, rowdier crowd. By the 1980s, though, this place was struggling amid changing tastes and competition from other Strip landmarks like the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Roxy. By 1993, the building was nearly derelict and facing closure, but it did find a savior in Johnny Depp, no less, who stepped in, leasing and remodeling space into the Viper Room. This venue opened as the Viper Room on August 14th of that year, and with Depp's star power, the club quickly became a cultural phenomenon, an intimate, exclusive venue that drew in celebrities, musicians, and Hollywood insiders. That said, there were some infamous events that have given this place a haunted reputation. Now to start, while I don't want to get too into it because I don't want to get sued, if BuzzFeed Unsolved thought they were going to get sued, I'm certainly not going there. Promising and talented actor River Phoenix would collapse and pass away just outside of the Viper Room on October 31st of 1993. He and his sibling, Joaquin Phoenix, who you might know well, had been inside that evening before River began experiencing, let's say, troubling symptoms, leading him to go outside to the curb where he sadly passed away. Further, in 1995, soap star Jason Donovan would pass away here under similar circumstances, and that same year, singer Courtney Love almost passed away here too, but she was revived through CPR by, get this, Johnny Depp himself. Also, Tony Fox, one of Johnny Depp's business partners in this Viper Room ordeal, who was actually suing him, also disappeared mysteriously in connection with this establishment in 2004, with all that was found of him being his abandoned truck with a rifle inside, but no body. Additionally, while this isn't explicitly ghost-related, to paint a picture of the illicit activity that occurred here, back in the 2000s, it was reported that the Viper Room hosted a high-stakes poker ring, with $50,000 buy-ins that were attended by the likes of folks like Leonardo DiCaprio, Ben Affleck, Tobey Maguire, and more. And the only reason we know of these is because a waitress demanded to get a cut of this action, but mob-connected gamblers assaulted her after these demands were made, and then she went public with it all. Thus, with a reputation of illicit activity, and sometimes even substances leading to folks passing away, it's absolutely no surprise that this place has a reputation of having a few ghosts, and thus it's been frequented by the oh-so-credible likes of paranormal investigators because of that. In terms of activity here, it's pretty diverse. Crew members with ghost adventures, for instance, reported recording a disembodied voice saying, "I'm confused," which an employee believed to be River Phoenix's spirit, still caught somewhere in the midst of his tragedy. Further, it's not just visitors that experience strange things here. Sadly, those that have to spend every day here also experience brushes with supposed supernatural phenomena. For example, longtime bartender Rita Fiora has told of feeling unseen hands as she worked, with her firm opinion being that these grabby ghosts are those of male high rollers of many years past. That said, she's also gotten text messages from who she describes as a ghost girl. These text messages are strange, and according to her, are generally asking questions, to which she'll respond out loud, and then she'll get a response back via text message. This ghost frequently expresses her annoyance that she isn't seen or heard by the bartender, apparently not understanding that she's passed on to the other side. Then there's also poltergeist activity here, and employees that have been here any length of time often report glasses inexplicably flying off tables, and a heavy feeling in the lower bar area. Because of all of this, ghost tour operators now list the Viper Room as a haunted stop, citing tales of Phoenix's ghost and even spectral gangsters lingering in the shadows, sometimes seen by patrons. Despite this haunting, though, the Viper Room still operates as a live music venue under local ownership. But according to city and press reports, the property was sold in 2018 for redevelopment, and new plans call for an 11-story mixed-use building on the block, including a new, larger space for the Viper Room at street level. And as far as I can tell, there are no plans for the Viper Room to change anytime soon. Nevertheless, observers note that Phoenix's tragedy and other incidents have turned the Viper Room into sort of a dark tourism spot, a place whose name evokes Hollywood's late-night excess. The RMS Queen Mary was a grand ocean liner produced by the company Cunard that was launched in 1934, and she would make her maiden Atlantic crossing in 1936. At 1,019 feet long, she was among the world's largest and fastest liners at the time, with clientele that matched this towering size, catering to royals, prominent figures, and Hollywood stars like Winston Churchill, Clark Gable, and the Gershwins, to name a few. In 1939, though, this luxurious purpose would see a premature end with the onset of World War II. During World War II, the RMS Queen Mary was transformed from a luxury ocean liner into one of the most important troop ships of the conflict, earning the nickname the Gray Ghost after being repainted in dull naval gray to limit its detection by submarines. Capable of carrying as many as 15,000 troops at a time, she played a critical role in transporting Allied soldiers across the Atlantic, far more than any other ship of her kind. The Mary's speed, too, was a benefit, as she was fast enough to outrun most enemy submarines, making her a vital asset in moving men quickly and safely. In addition to moving soldiers, she sometimes carried prisoners of war, and even war brides after the conflict. And by the war's end, the Queen Mary had transported more than 1 million military personnel, solidifying her place as a symbol of both Allied strength and the essential logistics that made victory possible. That said, all of this didn't occur without a hitch, and during World War II, one of the most infamous events involving this ship would occur, when she collided with her smaller escort ship, the HMS Curacao, which sank with many lives lost, as the Queen Mary was unable to render assistance. This particular event occurred because the HMS was escorting the Queen Mary as it was traveling rapidly at about 28 knots. They were both going in a zigzag formation as part of a standard wartime precaution against U-boat attacks, but the HMS made an error in its positioning just as the Queen Mary made a sharp turn, and thus the HMS was in its path, and the Queen Mary sliced through it like a knife through butter, causing the cruiser to sink nearly immediately. The Queen Mary was so large that at first those piloting didn't even know what happened, continuing on course without stopping to investigate. Among the 400 sailors aboard the HMS, at least about 330 lost their lives, and those who survived the initial impact were thrown into the cold waters of the Atlantic and stranded, many succumbing to hypothermia or drowning, as it took hours for a proper rescue effort to get underway. Now, after the war, the Queen Mary did resume her luxury cruises until jet airplanes made ocean liners obsolete. And in late 1967, fittingly on Halloween night, the Queen Mary made her final voyage, docking permanently in Long Beach, California, to become a floating hotel and museum where she remains today. Thus, the Queen Mary, now docked at Long Beach, has become a National Historic Landmark and a permanent fixture of the city's waterfront, anchored at Queens Highway, with her white and red funnels looming over Long Beach, serving as a hotel, museum, and event venue, and visitors can tour the Grey Ghost herself, hearing about everything from the ship's history to the supposed haunted encounters that call the place home today, encounters that are so plentiful that she is often ranked as one of the 10 most haunted places and hotels on Earth, even boasting a paranormal-themed stay package where guests can rent out the notorious stateroom B340 and engage in ghost hunts. Now, in terms of these ghosts, some accounts claim that as many as 150 spirits call this boat home, a figure that I'm sure is helped by the ship's collision with the HMS. But also, during her over 30 years of service, there were nearly 50 recorded deaths on boat, albeit most of them stemming from illness or accidents. And of course, reportedly, many of these souls stayed here for all eternity. To begin, the Queen Mary has tons of run-of-the-mill activity, knocks in empty corridors, sudden cold spots, phantom footsteps, mysterious voices, and ghostly apparitions that bear no name. That said, there are plenty of named hauntings here too. For instance, deep below the waterline in the ship's engine room, there's a heavy watertight door that's of course labeled the unlucky number 13. In 1966, crewman, 18-year-old John Peddler, was actually down here, when suddenly they'd have a run-of-the-mill safety drill. No big deal, right? Well, not quite. See, for this drill, John wanted to get out of the engine room, but the airtight doors had another idea. These heavy watertight doors would automatically shut during these drills, and as you might expect, poor John, that was trying to slip through the crack between the door and the wall, wasn't fast enough, and he got crushed. Thus, since this tragic event, many have reported seeing a bearded young man in blue coveralls, and also in the nearby Shaft Alley corridor, and hearing metal clanging or footsteps with no source. A scared guard once even saw a shadowy figure walking around in the engine room, which he attributed to being John. Then, of course, there's Stateroom B340, a first-class cabin on the Queen Mary's B deck. This room, believe it or not, was literally closed to guests for decades, and the supposed reason for this is because, I quote, of disturbing experiences that have occurred to guests here. Guests that previously stayed in this room complained of sheets being yanked off, faucets turning on by themselves, and doors opening and closing, and of course, unexplained knocks on the walls. One woman that stayed here decades ago even reported walking into this room to find an unseen hand pulling the bed covers, and I suppose attached to these invisible hands, the woman reported seeing a dark figure standing by the foot of the bed. In 2018, the ship even began renting out B340 with a haunted stay package, complete with a Ouija board and an EMF meter. Then, there's of course the first and second class swimming pools. Now, to start, the pools these days are totally drained, but that doesn't stop guests from continuing to hear splashing and finding wet footprints around these empty pools, even into modern day. Further, numerous witnesses have claimed to see a woman in a 1930s-style swimsuit by the dressing rooms, and also a little girl clutching a teddy bear. That little girl, by the way, is named Jackie, and she's supposed to have drowned in this pool decades ago. I should note, curiously, there's no official record of any drowning, even though some psychics have said otherwise, so take that detail for what you will, and let me know if you believe psychics over official records. In second class, visitors likewise report to hear Jackie's laughter and footsteps, and some say the pool area is even a spiritual vortex, which, I mean, maybe there's a sort of vortex in the toilets, but I'm not sure about the pool. There's also another famous ghost story that involves William E. Stark, an officer aboard the ship who in 1949 accidentally drank the poison carbon tetrachloride after being told to go have a drink of gin as a reward. Boy, that was a mix-up. He, of course, passed away days later aboard the ship. Today, his name still haunts the ship, and tour guides say that late at night, slams of empty cabinets and other odd sounds come from his spirit, who is still angrily searching for the gin rather than the poison that killed him. Finally, there's also the Queen's Salon in the Grand Art Deco first-class lounge. Numerous witnesses over the years have seen I quote, lady in white, gliding near the piano or dancing alone in a corner. What am I telling you, folks? If it's over 30 years old, there's always a lady in white. She supposedly wears an elegant vintage evening gown and seems oblivious to the living, as if waltzing to music that nobody else hears. Her identity and how she supposedly passed away is unknown, probably because, like most ladies in white, she's practically imposed upon this place rather than actually existing, but that has only added to her mystique, apparently because many say she's the ship's most famous passenger, which would be sad if true. Of course, beyond these well-known spots, there are other haunted places aboard the ship, though. In odd-numbered first-class staterooms, many guests have woken up to faucets turning on, phones dialing by themselves, or shadows in 1930s suits standing in their doorway. But for some reason, not in even-numbered ones. I don't have a clue why that would be. Then, the third-class children's playroom has often echoed with the cry of a baby, said to be a newborn who passed away there. So, in the end, the Queen Mary's haunted reputation is part history and part folklore. Regardless, the lore endures, and as a 1934 psychic predicted, the Queen Mary's greatest fame has come in port, when she no longer carries another fare-paying passenger. The Cecil Hotel was built in 1924 as a 700-room luxury hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Its marble lobby and stained glass windows reflected its founder's ambitions to build a luxurious place that would prosper for ages. But as often happens to these early luxury hotels, fate had a different outcome in mind. See, the Great Depression hit soon after opening, and downtown LA declined as a whole. By mid-century, rather than hosting the wealthy of LA, the Cecil was renting cheap, long-term rooms to transients, and becoming notorious for the crime and tragedy that took place there. I think if there's one place on this Southern California's haunted places list that you've heard of or expected to be here, I would guess it's probably the Cecil. And you expected it to be here because you've probably heard of the horrifying and mysterious things that have happened here, or its notorious clientele. In this light, over the year, the Cecil has seen dozens of violent or unexplained deaths, many of which have found their way into popular media as far back as just a few years after its opening. For instance, the first passing on the premises of the Cecil was in 1927, just about 3 years after it opened, when 57-year-old real estate dealer Percy Ormond Cook passed away by his own hand in room 1046 after checking in with a false name. And the reason for this was that he separated from his family just a week prior. Further, this incident wasn't alone, not by a long shot. In November of 1931, a 46-year-old man named W.K. Norden was found in room 1056 after taking in some poison. One Benjamin Dodick did something similar in September of 1932, and he was found by one of the maids. And in 1938, a Marine Corvette decided he'd try to fly home from the roof. I'm serious. I'm not trying to make light of this, by the way. This is all really tragic stuff. But I'm trying to hammer home that between the Cecil's opening in 1927 and just 11 years after it opened, 6 ghosts had already been added to its roster. It's pretty nasty stuff, and this sort of activity earned it a nickname that I can't say on YouTube, the Insert Blank Hotel. You get the picture. Okay, going on, let's be clear, it got worse here. Things have happened here that are so gruesome that even for someone someone seasoned at reading details about horrible things like me, I get a little bit queasy. Lots of living things, big and small, have gone, let's say, flying from the roof and windows of this hotel. Lots of people have gotten into arguments here and handled them in extra super bad ways, and many people ended up passing here by the hand of others, with those who did never being caught. Also, the craziest part about what I've gone over so far is that these infamous passings on the property aren't even the most famous thing about this place. Rather, it's the people who visited here and either, well, disappeared and were found under mysterious circumstances, or were really, really bad people before they even touched these walls. To begin, perhaps the most famous guest that's seen the walls of the Hotel Cecil was the infamous serial killer, the Night Stalker, or Richard Ramirez, a criminal who was active between 1984 and 1985. While one day I actually want to make a multi-part series on historical crime in LA, and I'll save the deep dive into the Night Stalker for that, Richard Ramirez, believe it or not, rented room 1402, and was known to engage in, let's say, unsavory activity here, such as actually dumping bloody clothing in the hotel dumpster, and roaming its lobby and halls in underwear. Further, he wasn't the only person of this variety to call this place home. Infamous Australian serial killer Jack Unterweger lived at the Cecil Hotel in 1991 while he went on a crime spree in Skid Row, which resulted in the passing of 3 individuals. Further, perhaps the Cecil's most recently famous guest stayed here in 2013. 21-year-old Canadian student Elisa Lam would go missing in 2013, and shortly after, CCTV footage would be found that showed Lam acting strangely inside of the Cecil's elevator. Seriously, the video is creepy, and I can sadly only show a few clips here for risk that news media claim this is footage, which is theirs, which it isn't, but the video shows Elisa toggling elevator buttons in the elevator and peering out of it as if she's playing hide and seek with someone, and then making weird dances or gestures as if she's having a conversation with someone who's right next to her, but not pictured by the camera. Of course, for a while, where Elisa went would remain a mystery. That is, until hotel guests began to complain of low water pressure and a foul taste. Thus, maintenance workers would go inspect the rooftop water tanks, and they'd find Elisa Lam floating in one of them, the same water that all the guests had been drinking. The coroner, of course, would rule this an accidental drowning, and would explain the strange behavior with Lam's known diagnosis of bipolar disorder. That said, the sensational footage associated with this case would fuel endless speculation, and would even become the subject of yet another Netflix true crime series. Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. Thus, if any single location is deserving of a haunted reputation on this list, it's probably the Hotel Cecil, and these stories of hauntings here don't disappoint, as it's widely considered among the most haunted places in the entire world. To start, admittedly sensationally popular YouTuber Pete Montzingo, who used to live across the street from the Cecil in 2021, recorded plenty of strange activity in the hotel that's pretty representative of the activity that supposedly happens here. He recorded doors opening and shutting in empty rooms, lights turning on in rooms where nobody appeared to be, and strange apparitions and shadows moving around on the hotel's top floor, which, for reference, also happens to be the same floor that the Night Stalker stayed on. He even reported seeing a silhouette of a man that was semi-transparent smoking on a balcony late at night. Now, I can't show this footage, but you should check it out, and while you're at it, give him a comment and let him know T's Storytime thinks he's pretty cool for sharing this footage. Further, far more common than filming the ghosts from the outside of this hotel are reports of people seeing ghosts that supposedly roam inside of it. The most haunted place, of course, is reportedly room 1402, the room rented by the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Now, I don't often dabble in religious dialogue on this channel, to each their own, but if anyone wasn't going to be allowed into heaven, it's definitely this guy. Visitors to this room, to be clear, normally have a typical stay, or as typical as you can have in a hotel like this, but some that visit say they've woken up to a feeling of tightness around their necks, or have felt warm, humid air, almost like hot breath on their ears, as if some unseen individual is watching them as they sleep. Further, inside of this hotel, strange sounds, crying, screaming, and footsteps, and knocking, coming from empty rooms, are the norm rather than the exception. And of course, perhaps the scariest thing about this hotel is the reputation that something inside of these walls does something to the brains of the living, making them more inclined to help you join the ranks of the deceased. Thus, the Cecil's lore is fueled by years of horrifying truth, and it's instilled a heck of a reputation upon it. And from what I can tell, it's not over yet. Today, it's actually no longer a hotel. It actually operates as low-income housing that pulls unhoused individuals off the street near Skid Row. So take that for what you will. As someone who grew up about 3 hours from Louisville, I've been to my fair share of horse racing venues, but never in my life have I been to one and thought, I think this place might have a ghost or two. The Mar Racetrack, just north of San Diego, breaks that convention though, and in its nearly 100 years of operation, it's collected quite a share of horse racing fans that never have to pay admission again. This track was opened in 1937 by actor Bing Crosby, and after just a short time, it became a meeting point for San Diego and LA's rich and famous, who came here in droves to gamble and watch horse racing. It's well known that in its heyday, famous visitors like Ava Gardner and Ann Miller could be seen in this track's exclusive grandstands, among many others that today are legends in the film industry. That said, while plenty of notable people came here, some would argue the most famous thing to attend this track wasn't even a person, but that it was a horse. A horse you've maybe seen as the title of a movie, one named Seabiscuit. Seabiscuit, to put it lightly, made a meteoric rise to the top of horse racing in the 1930s. And at this track in 1938, one of Seabiscuit's most famous races took place, where he duked it out with another famous racehorse, Ligaro, or is it Ligarat, ultimately winning and overcoming the many doubts about how he would perform. And in this spirit, today, fans still flock to this racetrack to watch horses duke it out similarly, with a beautiful view in the background. However, what many daytime visitors don't quite understand is that in the 1990s, something changed about this track. Now don't get me wrong, the place is still gorgeous, and it's a great place to watch a horse race by all accounts. But they say that, in the 1990s, when some renovations were going on, impacting everything from the clubhouse to the grandstands, they didn't just disturb the soil, but also the spirits of those that used to visit this location. These renovations, you see, seemed to kind of wake up the ghosts of the past. Pretty much overnight, the attendees of this track started to experience things we never mentioned before. For instance, employees began to report seeing shadowy tall figures walking around the corridors of the racetrack. And sometimes, when the first employees of the day arrived in the morning, from outside of locked rooms, they'd hear the jovial sounds of a party, and sometimes even glasses clinking into one another, as if someone was making a cheers to a great victory on the track. Further, despite being, 31 miles from the Mexican border, ice-cold drafts are sometimes felt outside. And sometimes, when nobody was even in attendance, the scent of cigar smoke could be smelled wafting through the air. Now, in terms of named hauntings, this place does have a few. There's Charles Whittingham, a famous horse trainer who actually worked here at Del Mar for many years. If you've been to this track, this name might sound familiar too, because the sports bar is named in his honor, which is fitting, given the apparition of Charles, a tall man, often seen in a dark suit, is often seen enjoying a martini in the afterlife. Perhaps Charles is the man responsible for the frequently reported EVP caught on the premises of a man saying, "martini." Then there's the supposed ghost of George Raft. George in life was a famous actor that passed away in the 1980s, but George, they say, might still be kicking around because one day a man was at the track waiting to buy tickets, and he reportedly turned around and did a double take because behind him was George Raft, a man he'd been watching in movies for most of his life, looking as alive and well as he'd been when he was, alive. Finally, of course, night security here often report to hear the sounds of horses running on the track, even long after hours. Now, perhaps this could be the sounds of cars driving on the nearby I-5, but the reports I read are pretty insistent, so hey, maybe I'm wrong. Now, if you grew up in the time of Step Brothers, when you hear the word Catalina, you clearly think about the Catalina wine mixer. But I'm here to tell you that the infamous event in which John C. Reilly and Will Ferrell stole the show is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to lore surrounding the Catalina Islands. For example, did you know that in January of 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, the U.S. Army actually sent 83 scouts to Santa Catalina Island because they were eyeing it to use it as a reservation, see internment camp, where they would take militant Native Americans who were rising up against the Union from the mainland and place them far away from where the U.S. government perceived they might cause trouble. This scouting party, by the way, didn't just scout it and leave. They actually, upon inspection, ruled that this area would be favorable and that it had good weather, suitable harbors, and plenty of fresh water, and thus they actually built barracks here for this internment camp. Barracks that remain on this island to this day near the island's two harbor regions as monuments to the Civil War and World War II. Now, at least in terms of this Civil War era internment camp, these buildings were never actually used, as by late 1864, the Confederacy was essentially on death's door, and Native American uprisings occurring adjacent to the Confederate uprising had settled. Thus, the few troops that were actually stationed here were returned to the mainland drum barracks, where there was actually still some level of concern that guns and gold might be stolen by the locals, as Southern California at the time was suspected to be full of Confederate sympathizers. That said, these barracks were eventually used in some capacity. In the 1920s and 30s, film crews would visit this location, using Santa Catalina Island as the set for a film meant to mimic a South Pacific island. And while visiting this island and filming films like Mutiny on the Bounty and Old Ironside, film crews would actually sleep in these old barracks. Also, during World War II, they would see use in the form of a training station for new recruits. Now, since then, the use of these barracks has been less official, and nowadays they're managed by the Isthmus Yacht Club and maintained for their cultural significance, given they're the oldest structures on the entire island. Still, old does not mean empty. Rather, to this day, it seems that someone might be staying in them, or at the very least, that they have a visitor. Just uphill from these old barracks, there's a B&B, and while I'm not sure what era this dates back to, probably the World War II era if I had to guess, they say that a woman in white will sometimes be seen materializing inside of this home, or just outside of it, and then that she walks down to these old Civil War barracks, entering it by phasing through the front door, and of course, never leaving. And while I'd love to say that the two ghosts are in there boogasming, the account goes that rather than hearing two people go, "Boo God," and "Spook me harder, daddy," that instead, after this translucent woman enters the building, they often smell tobacco and fish, as if these two are old lovers having a cookout from beyond the grave. Quickly, before we get into the haunting of the Hollywood sign, I want to say that in the bit of research I did do for Hollywood, it turns out this place is downright packed with ghosts and other things that are crazy, and therefore I want to formally announce that later this year, or maybe in the early winter, I'm going to make a Hollywood's Dark Places video, where I focus on haunted places, folklore, cryptids, and true crime that hail from around Hollywood. And that video might be just as long as this one. That said, the Hollywood sign itself is perched on Mount Lee above Los Angeles. The sign was originally built in 1923 as a temporary billboard for a new real estate development. Originally, it didn't actually spell out Hollywood, rather it spelled out Hollywood Land, of course in huge 50-foot tall white lettering that was studded with about 4,000 light bulbs. It would even alternate the word that was being illuminated, flashing Holly, then wood, then land in sequence at night. If you look back to newspaper archives at the time, you'll actually find it documented in a way that's almost scathing that this sign was specifically made to, I quote, attract home buyers and not tourists, even though around the 20s and 30s, the word Hollywood was already starting to become synonymous with fame and success in media. That said, as with all brand new novelties, the sign wasn't immediately appreciated, and over the next 25 years or so, it did fall into disrepair, with the last four letters, land, even being removed, leaving the sign to simply read Hollywood. By the 1950s, though, perhaps given their age, the sign had gone from novelty to holding an iconic status, and the community actually came together at this point, and the sign was actually replaced permanently in 1978 by Hollywood celebrities with a much sturdier steel structure, which permanently cemented these letters into the hills of LA. With that in mind, what more is there to say? The Hollywood sign is iconic, and I can count on two hands the number of people I've known that made it a point to see this sign when they visited Southern California. Now, despite its literally bright image, the Hollywood sign also carries a dark side that dates back to its early years. A dark side that principally comes from the passing of one individual, a woman named Peg Entwistle. Peg Entwistle was a British-born actress, a woman who, like many, struggled to succeed in Hollywood back in the 1930s. And perhaps it's this lack of success that on September 16th of 1932 led her to make the venture to the Hollywood sign, to climb up its maintenance ladder to the top of the Hollywood land signs H, and to jump. She'd be discovered later that day by a truck driver driving around the sign on Beechwood Canyon Road, who actually came across her lying at the base of the hill near the foot of the sign. This tragic passing pretty much immediately made headlines, and not only did it cast scrutiny on the pressures of the LA movie industry, but it also cemented Peg as the first and most prominent ghost said to haunt the hills of Hollywood. Now, in terms of these hauntings, it's said that many hikers and joggers in the area, and even some park rangers, have come forward claiming to see something sort of odd. In modern day, mind you, they claim to see a young woman dressed in 1930s-style clothing lingering near the Hollywood sign. One of the most notable accounts of this comes from Griffith Park Ranger John Arbogast, who claimed he's seen Peg multiple times, and that not only does Peg appear around the sign, but that late at night, especially if there's a thick fog, you might smell flowers, gardenias specifically, which, funny enough, was the scent of the perfume that Peg was wearing. Of course, shortly after you smell this, he also says you're liable to see this woman wandering the ridges around Griffith Park, acting disoriented. And this is less ghostly and more fun. In 1944, the H in the Hollywood sign actually fell over. And while logic might dictate that this could have been due to, weather, or maybe the deterioration of the sign after 25 years of abuse, others of course say that this H falling over was a sign that Peg, from beyond the grave, is still able to use some of that Hollywood magic. So, every Haunted Places video, even though I was a nerd in high school, I like to take it upon myself to play high school bully, and poke fun at the fact that in addition to going through the throes of teenage angst, some poor kids out there are getting chased by forces from beyond the grave, while they desperately try to grapple with their changing bodies and their lack of interest in learning math and science. Our tribute in this video is Anaheim High School, which is located at 811 West Lincoln Avenue in Anaheim, California. The school was established in 1898, making it the oldest of the high schools in Anaheim, and the third oldest high school in Orange County. And it's represented by the sort of controversial mascot of the colonists, even into modern day. In addition to all of this high school is supposedly haunted as all get out, and would even give El Paso High School, which we talked about back in February, a run for its money in terms of the number of spirits and their level of activity. Now, as it should be, the most supposedly haunted place on campus is the main building of this high school, and many say the most haunted portion of this main building is the auditorium. Many of these strange events that have occurred here, of course, are often first reported by campus safety aides and other staff that watch over the premises when students aren't really around. In this light, one campus safety aide named Trian Romeros has come forward with quite a few stories about the supposed haunting in Anaheim. Her first experience with this sort of activity occurred on a Sunday morning on campus, when she and her brother were moving some tables and chairs back into the school auditorium after borrowing them from the school for a personal event. On this morning, they would walk into the auditorium and they'd see something strange. In the middle of the auditorium floor would be a broom, but it wasn't lying on its side or on the ground. It was standing straight up, as if someone was holding it. They walked over to it. They waved their hands all around it, and they made sure that there wasn't a string attached to it or anything. And then her brother would go over and kick it, knocking it over, and it would fall over just as you would have expected. There was also a later date, where one morning Miss Romeros got into work presumably before anyone else, entering the main office at around 6:30 a.m. and saying hello in the office only to be met with no response, and the lights were all turned off. No matter, she thought she'd settle in for the day regardless. The thing is, though, she heard, loud as day, the sound of someone clearing their throat, like, After this, she'd check the room, but nobody was there, and she'd noticed that one of the chairs was kind of strangely pulled out pretty far, further than the custodians would have left it, as if someone was sitting right there in that chair. There's also another security aide on campus that's reported similar strange activity. This aide is named Priscilla Rodriguez, and one morning, while trying to unlock a room to let some students inside, she and the janitor, who were unlocking it, heard voices coming from the room that should have been empty. She figured it was some students causing trouble inside, so she went to the other doorway of this room with another key, planning to have her and the janitor bust in at the same time so they could catch the kids in the act. That said, this didn't go as planned. Sure, she busted into the entrance, but inside, instead of finding students skipping class, she found something troubling. An empty room with desks stacked on top of one another, as if she'd just wandered onto a set filming Poltergeist 2. So as for who this haunting might be, there's minimal documented events to lend any credence to this haunting, but there are reports you'll find circulated that a woman named Carol, who worked here in the early 1900s, might have been crushed in an accident in the auditorium. And perhaps that's why to this day the translucent apparition of a woman, from time to time, is also seen walking down the empty halls of the school at night. In Porterville, California, there's a home that, on the outside, looks like a simple historical house, like a novelty, and nothing more. But sometimes when a place is tied to as much tragedy as this one, it makes you wonder if a place can maybe be cursed, and can the victims of these curses live on to the present. This home's history began when it was built in 1891, after the move of the Zalud family, a family of Bohemian immigrants to Porterville. When they first got here, the family admittedly seemed to be nothing but lucky, and dare I say, you could make the case that they were living the American dream. John Zalud, the family patriarch, started a saloon with a card room in it in town, and through this card room he had success in high-stakes betting. Through this, he earned boatloads of money, and soon the family was proverbially rolling in it. That said, the other shoe would drop, and it would do so in dramatic fashion. The bad news would begin in 1912, when Mary Jane, one of the Zalud family children, got tuberculosis, from which she'd pass away. Then just 5 years later, in 1917, the husband of one of the other Zalud children, Annie Zalud, his name being William Hubert Brooks, was killed, actually being shot in the lobby of the Pioneer Hotel by a woman named Julia Howe, who he'd been harassing to some extent, and he was just sitting in a rocking chair when this happened. To make matters worse, this was considered by the courts a justifiable homicide, and the woman wasn't punished at all. Now, I don't want to get into whether he deserved it here, by the way, but I will say I've read some sources suggesting he may have, but I'm not getting into that. Then Edward Zalud, John Zalud's son, died in 1922 after being thrown from a horse that he was riding. And as if this wasn't all enough, nobody else died, but Pearl Zalud, another one of the children, ended up breaking her hip in an accident, which resulted in her marriage being called off, which for some reason is included in all of the discussions of tragedies happening to this family, but is in no way comparable to someone dying. Anyways, this string of tragedies was over at this point, but it resulted in a very different feeling about the home they'd made in Porterville, and it resulted in the remaining family choosing to spend less time in the home, only stopping by now and again. Thus, the last Zalud to ever live here was Pearl, who would pass away in 1962, donating the property to the city afterwards to be made into a museum that houses many artifacts related to this unfortunate string of tragedies. And as you might expect, any home tied to this much death is going to be rumored to be permanently attached to that death, and therefore this place is supposed to be haunted. Now to start, folks report medicinal smells around the home, smells that some say are particularly common around the anniversary of young Mary Jane's passing, and smells that are perhaps a remnant of the medicine they used to treat her TB. Often, around the times these smells show themselves, they say that coughing and wheezing can be heard faintly coming from the room where she met her in. Then there's the, I quote, haunted murder chair, which, as you might have inferred, is the chair in which Annie Zalud's husband, William, was shot after harassing the woman in town. As you might expect from a rocking chair, it's said this chair will occasionally rock on its own, and that sometimes at night you might hear swearing coming from the room the chair was in. Perhaps the man is mad because his murderer was acquitted on all charges. Further, and I mean, take what these ghost guys say with a large grain of salt, but a few of them decided to sit in this chair when they visited, and they subsequently felt sick, and one of them even speculated he might be having a heart attack. So that doesn't sound fun. Additionally, I'm not sure how this is tied to the Zalud family, but there's also legends about some gnome-like creature that haunts Porterville, and the U.S. ghost folk claim that the creature has actually decided to live in the Zalud home, possibly because of the dark things that happened here. They even reportedly caught an EVP of a creepy little chuckle while they were visiting that they attributed to this gnome. In terms of more credible witnesses to strange activity, a police officer a few years back actually drove by this home at around 2 a.m., only to witness lights turning on and off inside of it, and he actually radioed a city worker to come check with him that the building was indeed empty. But of course, as the city worker was on the way, the lights all went out simultaneously on their own. And finally, I should note, the last Zalud to live here, as I said, was Pearl Zalud, and in her old age, she herself actually believed that her departed family members still lived in this house, and I even saw one claim that she believed that she too was destined to stay here for all eternity. Nowadays, of course, you can not only visit this museum, but you can try your luck at observing the spirits inside. In October, I don't know when in October, but in October, I found that this property offers some ghost tours, and you can try to find your luck at finding ghosts among the many knickknacks and belongings of the Zalud family that are dotted throughout this property. As a current Midwesterner who drives way too much every year, I have to admit, I love getting spooked out when I'm driving at night, and therefore, there's nothing that quite does it for me like a good haunted road. Thus, when I saw that just east of San Diego, there was a road that was haunted not only by a ghost, but also by a cryptid, I was excited to swing by and take a look. As for the setting of this horror story, well, it's Proctor Valley Road, a quiet, rural, and mostly dirt road that runs between East Lake on the west and Jamul, California on the east. Along this road, there are hardly any lights, and it runs for about 5 miles through the hills alongside the San Diego National Wildlife Refuge. Now, in terms of legends here, as I said, there are a couple, and I like to think this pair of legends exists instead of a single legend because the road runs between two otherwise isolated towns, which might have independently developed their own folklore. We'll start with the story of ghostly headlights that run up and down this road, though. Admittedly, this haunted headlights legend is pretty standard, and it fits into the rich American tradition of ghost lights that we've seen everywhere from the Missouri-Oklahoma border to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, essentially telling of lights that float along or near roadways without any apparent source. Further, it adopts a bit of a Clinton Road element to it if you're familiar with New Jersey's hauntings. They say that as you drive along, you might see these phantom headlights pop up behind you or in front of you, and as they draw near, they won't just tailgate you, they'll actively come up beside you and try to encourage you to veer off the road. The legend, of course, says that these aren't some simple headlights, but rather they're the ghostly lights that belonged to an individual's car that crashed their car along this road and perished a long time ago. Now, I don't know exactly why this individual has returned from beyond the grave as an angry, vindictive spirit, but that's the story. So, as for the truth of the matter, while I can't find any specific incidents that occurred along this road, I'm sure they've happened, but I'd say that rather than a ghost, it's probably a little more likely that these lights are those of hikers and campers that are on the nearby trails. I mean, just take a look at this. There are hiking trails along literally every single inch of this road. Now, less easily attributed to something logical is the story of the Proctor Valley Monster. To start, I know this isn't the California Cryptids video, even though that video will be amazing, but this legend harks back to the 1950s in most accounts, and it tells a story of some lovers that were looking to get out of town together, away from the prying eyes of their parents, park their car, and of course, have a nice civil discussion about the value of abstinence and safe, clean fun outside of the bedroom before marriage. I'm sure they were in no way, shape, or form influenced by the primal drives below their waistline, being good Californians and all, but at some point during this engaging exchange, the man would get out of the car, and he'd need to use the restroom. Something that I'm not going to speculate about at all, and I'm sure is in no way related to what they were doing out here in these quiet backwoods. The lady, of course, would stay in the car though, and she waited, and waited, and waited, and why was this guy taking so long? She'd of course step out of the car then, and outside she'd find, in most stories, that the man was just flat out gone. Then she'd walk down the road a little bit, yelling his name over and over, only to come across a tree and see that he was suspended in it. Obviously not doing so hot, given part of the tree was penetrating him just like he penetrated... Wait, sorry, they weren't doing that. Anyhow, he ended up surviving, but he told a story of a monster that would come get him while he was spelling his name in the dirt, and this monster would throw him in the tree before going on its way. The man gave no description of the creature, nor was there any subsequent frenzy over the monster like you often see documented in cryptid encounters, which is kind of unusual. That said, there was some rumor of this monster circling the community prior to this event, and the first actual mention of this monster, they think, comes from 1947, when two middle school boys who lived on a nearby dairy farm off this road, while walking on the road, actually came across a deceased calf, and they would go back to their middle school and tell their friends that rather than the young cow getting loose and being struck like a vehicle, there were clear marks that a monster had had its way with the poor calf. Anyhow, that's the Proctor Valley Road monster and the ghostly headlights there. Now, if I were a betting man, I think the scariest thing you'll find out here is probably an overzealous Border Patrol agent from some stories I read, but I'm not a betting man, so who knows? Maybe there really is a monster at large in these mountains, waiting to be found or waiting to find you. Silver City Ghost Town in Bodfish, California, is a privately owned historical site established in the 1960s by Howard and Frances Brown, with the very specific goal of preserving authentic 19th century structures from deteriorating or disappearing. Unlike fabricated tourist attractions or movie set replicas, like those you might see up on a hill in Kentucky off the interstate, the buildings at Silver City are genuine historical structures that were physically relocated from abandoned mining towns in Kern County and surrounding areas of the southern Sierra Nevadas. This project began during a time when many historic mining towns like Keysville, Clairville, Whiskey Flat, and Isabella City were being razed, looted, or just neglected. And as these settlements vanished, the families behind these efforts worked to salvage their buildings, transporting them themselves to the current Bodfish site. The structures weren't just reconstructed or stylized, they were literally taken apart right where they were and reassembled with their original materials right here in Bodfish, with modifications only made to ensure they were stable and safe so people could actually, go inside and such. In total, over 20 original buildings were moved and preserved. These buildings included actual historical facilities too, like the general stores, schoolhouses, blacksmith shops, cabins, and a jail, and many contain authentic 19th century artifacts. And the majority of Silver City's structures are verifiable too, making it one of the few places where visitors can view a substantial collection of original Gold Rush era architecture. That said, when this fantastic spot was cobbled together, the developers only meant to bring the buildings. They didn't mean to bring the spirits that were tied to them. But hey, sometimes in life, or death, you just don't have a choice. Now, to begin, I don't know how I got this far into the channel without knowing there's a national directory of haunted places, but regardless, they claim this place is on the list. And many say that this Silver City is, I quote, the most haunted place in Kern County, and a place that PBS's This Old House called the 6th most haunted site in America. In my research, the most common odd happening here is poltergeist activity. I saw records of the individuals that work here really doubling down on this and claiming that things just go flying on their own. I saw records that one of the individuals that worked here actually doubted these claims of poltergeist activity and the claims that things go flying on their own, except one day he and two others, who he remarked were absolutely sober, saw a heavy lunch pail that would have been used by an old miner lift into the air and go flying 12 feet across a room. Others report seeing glass bottles that would have previously held the miner's favorite alcoholic brew floating through the air inside of buildings. And they've also observed doors and windows to open and close without any prompting, which, pinch me if I'm wrong, but is that not the most stereotypically haunted ghost town thing ever? Also, there's a violin that hangs in front of the general store here, and some say that around dusk, it's apparently extremely common to hear the strings on this violin start to pluck themselves as you walk by, almost as if this old instrument is calling out to someone to play it all these years later. Otherwise, you know the drill. Whether it's an EVP or a strange figure in a photograph, Silver City is laying those hauntings out there. And there are plenty other more typical hauntings that call Silver City home, ranging from shadowy apparitions watching guests from upper floor windows that have long since ceased being used, to hearing your name beckoned with a thick drawl by someone who hasn't physically been in a building for hundreds of years. And hey, for the actually pretty reasonable price of $5.50 per the source I'm looking at least, you can check this place out on your own. While I think it might cost extra too, they also host ghost hunts and lantern tours here, which, by golly, I'm very far from Silver City, but the images of these hunts look downright charming, and I'd absolutely love to attend something like this one day. Now, if you are not aware, I love, and I'm talking love, when a haunted place doesn't get all bashful about their haunting. I mean, come on, if you're a historic place and some of that history, according to your guests, supposedly lives on, you should absolutely be proud of that. And to my surprise, the Hotel del Coronado is indeed proud. And on their very website, they share their supposedly haunted tales for all to see. That said, I will admit, when your supposed ghost is of the kind variety, sort of like Casper, but a little more effeminate, it's a little bit easier to advertise it than when it's, say, a famous serial killer or something. We'll get to that in Northern California a lot, I think. As for its history, the Hotel del Coronado is often simply called the Hotel Del, and it's a famous historic beachfront resort located on Coronado Island in San Diego, California. It opened its doors on February 19th of 1888, and it was designed by architect James W. Reed, with a distinctive Victorian architectural style characterized by a large red roof, white exterior, and ornate woodwork. At the time of its completion, the hotel was the largest resort hotel in the world, hear that, the whole world, and the first to be constructed entirely of wood. It was built for just about $1 million, and the Hotel Del became an immediate symbol of luxury and elegance around San Diego, attracting high society and wealthy guests. And it was one of the first resorts to offer electric lights, central heating, and various other resort amenities. Over the decades, it also hosted numerous famous guests, including Charlie Chaplin, Marilyn Monroe, and Thomas Edison. And it was even the setting for the 1959 movie Some Like It Hot, starring Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis, which added to its fame. Today, the Hotel Del remains a luxurious and highly sought-after destination, and it blends history with modern amenities, attracting visitors from around the world to stay on its premises and enjoy its breathtaking Pacific coastline just outside of its walls. That said, those that come for the beautiful coastal views might leave with something else entirely, a sighting of an old guest tied to a tragic tale that, by all accounts, should no longer be roaming these halls, but happily does so anyways. According to the hotel itself, this tale involves a woman who was first referred to as the Beautiful Stranger. This stranger arrived on Thanksgiving Day of 1892 to the hotel alone, checking into what was then room 302, a room now numbered 3327 following the incident that occurred. When checking in, it said that this woman looked sick and sad, and that she'd wait in this room for 5 whole days, after which she'd be found deceased by her own hands on the steps of the hotel leading out to the ocean. Afterwards, given the hotel couldn't identify her, I guess they didn't take IDs at the time, they'd circulate her photograph, only to eventually find this beautiful stranger was actually one Kate Morgan, a maid in Los Angeles. Now, Kate was married, but history informs us she was estranged from her husband. That said, it was not her husband that she was waiting for at this hotel. Rather, based on the context, people think it was a lover. The reports go that Kate was actually making her way to this hotel by train from LA with a man. But at some point, on their way to San Diego, witnesses aboard the train observed that she and this man got into some sort of kerfuffle, and then he'd leave her behind. Despite this, she of course would go on to the hotel alone, where she would ultimately seal her own fate. Of course, since this time, whether you're visiting the hotel or working there, you might experience something strange. Largely, of course, in modern-day room 3327, the room where Kate spent her final days. Here, folks have reported largely electrical phenomenon, televisions going on and off without prompting, and lights flickering, that sort of thing. Further, even when their windows are closed, guests here will feel a cool breeze at times, and sometimes they'll even smell flowery perfume, as if a perfume-laden woman just entered the room. I also saw accounts that belongings will briefly go missing in this room, moving from place to place, and that now and again, if you're lucky, as you lie in bed relaxing instead of exploring the city you paid good money to visit, one of my personal favorite hobbies, you might hear your own name whispered in your ear, but not in a traditional way, almost as if someone is singing your name quietly under their breath, trying to lull you into a false sense of security, or perhaps gently scaring you into leaving the room a little bit early. Further, Kate isn't just confined to this room. She apparently has the agency to leave as she wishes. For one, she's often seen in the halls of this hotel wearing a black lace dress, walking about as if she's still a modern-day guest, just, of course, in much older clothing than most modern individuals. She's also been seen walking along the shore just outside of this resort, taking in the breeze and feeling the sand on her feet, like she found the ultimate hack to stay at a coastal Californian resort forever free of charge. There's also a book about all of this named Beautiful Stranger, The Ghost of Kate Morgan, and the Hotel del Coronado, that the director of the heritage programs at the hotel published herself. Of course, if you're richer than me and you can afford it, you're welcome to come look for Kate yourself, though I don't want to look up what a resort in San Diego costs. But hey, if you do have the moolah to investigate this place, it looks gorgeous, and the stories make it sound like Kate awaits you by the beach. So come enjoy the sounds of the ocean breeze, and possibly the whisper of your name alongside them. The University of California, Los Angeles traces its roots back to 1919, when it was officially established as the southern branch of the University of California, making it the second campus in the UC system just after Berkeley. Before that, the institution operated as the Los Angeles State Normal School, a teacher training college founded in 1881. With the rapid growth of Los Angeles in the early 20th century, civic leaders and educators recognized the need for a major public research university in Southern California. So in 1927, the regents authorized the construction of a new campus in Westwood. By 1929, UCLA opened its iconic campus, with buildings like Royce Hall and Powell Library, designed in Romanesque Revival style. The school quickly expanded its academic offerings, earning the right to grant graduate degrees, and establishing a reputation for both scholarly research and accessibility to a growing urban population. And if you aren't aware, in the modern era, UCLA has evolved into one of the most prestigious public universities in the country, and it's consistently ranked among the top U.S. institutions. That said, just because a university is prestigious doesn't mean it won't have any hauntings. UCLA, you see, actually has a track record of researchers housed in its walls who've actually studied the topic of life after death. First, though, let's start with a story of a supposed haunted place I found on campus. Dykstra Hall. Dykstra Hall, formerly Clarence A. Dykstra Hall, is actually pretty modern. It was opened in 1959 as UCLA's first high-rise residence hall, on what is now known as the Hill. On its own, it marked a major turning point in UCLA's evolution from what was largely a commuter campus to one with a substantial on-campus student housing community. Now, to be clear, the stories of the hauntings in this hall are probably better described as whispers, as unlike some schools, UCLA doesn't just come out and say, "Hey, we're haunted," like my alma mater, University of Tennessee. That said, if you do some Googling, you'll find chatter on forums and blogs here and there that something strange might be going on in old Dykstra. Now, I did a bit of digging and actually found one story that sort of gave me the chills. The story goes that it was the end of the academic year in 2015 or 2016, and the undergraduates had just moved out. Thus, resident assistants were going in pairs, room to room, to ensure that none of the undergraduates left anything valuable behind before the housekeeping staff came through and thoroughly cleaned up the place. Now, this whole check around the building thing went on without incident mostly, and the RAs made it to the third floor of the building. But this is where their luck changed. They started going through one of the closets, and they left that door open because it didn't matter if they closed it. And then they moved on to the rest of the dorm room, and just as one of the RAs looked under the bed in the room, they both jumped when they heard an ear-piercing scream ring through the room. A woman's scream that came from the front of the room. Just following this, the closet they'd left open, an empty one, they said it slammed shut just before their eyes. And the RAs, well, this was plenty of motivation for them to go for a jog, all the way from the third floor to the first and then out the front door. Further, as I hinted, there's an interesting case associated with UCLA that took place in the 1970s that's also worthy of discussion, that involves a UCLA instructor actually studying occult topics, such as life after death. Now, in some of our weird folklore videos, we've dove into the topic of the weird 60s and 70s research into the veracity of remote viewing that was performed by various scientific institutes and the government, and involved, for lack of a better way to put it, loads of substances if you catch my drift. One of these labs that in an unofficial capacity was looking into this question was that of Thelma Moss, who was an actor, scriptwriter, psychologist, and advocate for substances. But between 1966 and 1978, she somehow landed herself a job to teach psychology at UCLA, which she did while also running an unsanctioned and unfunded lab in what is now the Cecil Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, calling it the Parapsychology Laboratory. And here, to put it bluntly, strange things happened. For instance, various celebrities claimed that they visited this lab and learned how to do things that were unusual, such as Carol Burnett, a comedian who I'm pretty sure wasn't kidding when she claimed that Moss literally helped her make photographic images with her mind. Further, they worked on tangential work to that of the government, practicing remote viewing, or the ability to see places, things, or events that are far away from one's physical location. They also dabbled in paranormal investigation, with the most famous case being when Carrie Gayer, an associate of Moss, was approached at a bookstore by one Doris Bither, who claimed in her nearby home in Culver City there was a poltergeist. And despite being academic affiliates, the labs took these claims very seriously. They'd go on to visit this home, and sort of immediately they were stonewalled by Doris when they went to her home, almost thinking she was a kooky person. But then, out of nowhere, when they were about to leave because she wasn't giving them any answers, a pan went flying out of a cupboard. And that set everything in motion. Over the next few weeks, they'd visit this home again and again, finding no evidence this was being faked, and observing everything from objects flying about, to glowing green lights, to feeling cold spots. In the eyes of those involved, this was extremely real, and while definitely shakier than research performed in an actual sanctioned lab, it sort of lives on as that one time a UCLA professor observed evidence of a ghost or something. Of course, as you might expect, given this lab was unsanctioned at best and possibly unethical at worst, there have been claims that all that was experienced here was confirmation bias and possibly the influence of other things they were involved in, and the lab would go on to close in 1978. Next to the 210 freeway in Los Angeles lies a relatively old dam. This dam was built in 1920 in response to devastating floods that plagued the region in 1914, and it was named the Devil's Gate, after a nearby rock formation that resembled the Devil's Head, according to some. The dam was strategically placed at a narrow point in the Arroyo Seco Canyon, making it an ideal place to capture water that flowed from the San Gabriel Mountains to protect downstream areas like Pasadena and even downtown LA from flash flooding. Further, this dam is just south of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and both of these places strangely collide to form the ghost story here that is, admittedly, a little bit shakier than some other ones on this list. See, built as part of this dam is also a bridge that runs over it, a bridge you can still walk on today. And sure, here you might get a great view of the San Gabriel Mountains, but beyond just a pretty view and a bit of water, there's also a lot more to see here. To start, there's a rock formation, the Devil's Rock, which the dam was named after. But the real attraction here is a tunnel that supposedly is also a portal to hell, and it's strangely affiliated with an individual named Jack W. Parsons, the co-founder of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So, to be clear, when it was built, this tunnel was just a tunnel, and I wouldn't fault anyone who assumed its reputation was simply associated with the fact that the dam has devil in its name, and therefore you can count on it being riddled with rumors because of that alone. That said, Jack W. Parsons is said to have gone on walks around here back in the 1930s, and rumors say that at some point he started walking into this tunnel with graduate students at some point in the mid-1930s. And here, well, I'm not sure how much of this is folklore and how much is fact, but they said that Jack, despite clearly being a staunch scientist in one part of his life, would engage in occult rituals right here too, involving his graduate students, and that these rituals would ultimately summon something other that lingers in this dam and tunnel today. Folks that visit this dam today and are brave enough to walk through this tunnel at night thus report hearing strange noises, such as EVPs calling out their name, or asking for help, for instance. And some feel strange pinches on their bodies, or even feel pushed. Further, it's said that this darkness has attracted plenty of very real and well-documented crime over the years. For example, this dam has been central to many mysterious disappearances and murder cases. One example that occurred here is that one 8-year-old Tommy Bauman was actually near this dam when he was abducted, last being seen walking on trails near the dam. And later, it would come to light that the man responsible for this was named Mac Ray Edwards, a man that actually took more than just poor Tommy, with many of the young individuals being taken right here near this dam, with some thinking he performed his own occult rituals in this very tunnel. Now, if you're brave enough to actually visit this dam and the supposed shadowy entrance to hell here, getting here is perfectly legal. Just start at the nearby park to the northwest and make your way towards the dam. Once you're there, the tunnel that runs under it is said to be tough to miss. Just west of Escondido, there's a beautiful forest that, admittedly, might be better described as a shrubby landscape beneath its surface. It's deceptive in that, in equal measure to its beauty, it's said to be haunted. As for some history, before European settlement in this region, the forest was inhabited by the Lozano natives, a group that inhabited the coastal California and inland valleys in San Diego County. And these people gave way to the Spanish settlers in the 18th century, who established missions, ranchos, and more throughout the region, ultimately becoming a formal preserve in 1995. Today, this reserve is about 800 acres of open space, which I think is plenty of space for a few mysteries and hauntings. From what I can tell, the first whispers of otherworldly activity here probably stem from Native American legend, as there are rumors that the Owl Witch of modern Mexican folklore, or something similar, calls this preserve home. The story goes that this 10-foot-tall white owl woman soars above the forest's tree line, and if one enters this forest at night, either on one of the nearby roads, by car, or by foot, they say that this owl might swoop down upon you, or even land on and damage your car. Some have even claimed that accidents have been caused on nearby roads when this large owl has swooped down at night, though I couldn't find any record of this formally. Further, if you're hiking with your buddy and they start acting weird, you might want to pay close attention, because they say this variation of the Owl Witch is able to possess those that enter the forest, sometimes driving individuals to harm those that accompany them. There's also another version of this owl story that says that this Owl Witch is less a generic owl witch and more the protagonist of her own story, which is kind of fun. In this version, a woman usually lived on the land that today is the Elfin Forest recreation area, and it's said that while she was out in the forest foraging and away from her husband and son, they were taken from this world by a couple of bandits. Or other versions say that she was with them and she got away. Either way, she'd run into town on her own and arrived tattered, with ripped up clothing, covered in dirt, with tears in her eyes, telling of the attack and the fact that she was able to escape. That said, she wasn't just thankful to survive, she became vindictive and looking for revenge. And the story goes this woman started researching black magic, and one day, because of that, she'd return to these woods to face the ruffians that took her family from there, and she would get a revenge after all, using newfound magical abilities to make short work of them. That said, in gaining these powers, she also went mad, and now they say she takes the form of an owl, flying over the forest and keeping watch over what she now considers to be her domain, afflicting those who venture into her territory at night with a sort of death curse. That said, I also found sources saying that there's a nearby psychic village, because of course there is, this is California after all, and they claim that in their past they actually helped this owl witch find the light for what it's worth, and that she's no longer there. There are also supposedly Native American ghosts, according to some stories. Historically speaking, I read that this place was a spot where multiple tribes would meet, at first diplomatically, but later for less civil reason. Thus, some say there are Native American burial grounds somewhere in this forest, and on several occasions, people have seen people wearing clothing that they would have worn thousands of years ago, walking these lands. And sometimes they've even seen native apparitions or translucent figures hanging from trees, as if they were suffering the consequences of a conflict that occurred well before our time here. Okay, before you yell at me, I don't know my California geography too well, so I looked up what do people consider Southern California, and the northernmost area considered Southern California, most people said, was Bakersfield. This is per Reddit though, so gosh knows if that's true. So yes, I get that the agricultural and central portions of California are sort of a different world than the northern and southern megalopoli, but we're splitting it, with Bakersfield being the furthest north point in this video for simplicity. Now, in Bakersfield, there's a place called the Fox Theater. This theater opened on October 13th of 1930, having been built in the Art Deco style by Styles O. Clement. Now, earlier in this channel, we've actually said this Fox Theater name before, but it was in reference to theaters elsewhere in the USA. And that's because the Fox Theater wasn't only one unique theater, but rather a chain of establishments, sort of like the many Orpheum theaters you'll see around the country. The Fox Theaters were a chain of movie theaters that became popular around the USA in the early to mid 20th century. That said, most of these theaters were torn down, but this one got lucky, and over the years it had a number of restorations. And in 2009, the city of Bakersfield brought it back to its original splendor. And these days, while it does host films, it also has live performances, concerts, ballets, and musicals, some of which they say are attended by guests that loved this theater so much they decided to keep watching it from beyond the grave. Now, the Fox Theater's haunting is pretty simple, actually. To start, it's said that in a way, this theater has its own little Hunchback of Notre Dame legend going on. Up at the top, it's got a clock tower, and it's nothing too substantial, just a few clocks facing in the cardinal directions with a small little decorative balcony on each of them. The thing is, though, there are rumors that during construction, while this clock tower was being built, a worker fell from this peak to the ground below, and ultimately passed away. Since then, well, even though they completed the clock tower without further incident, it's said that something strange occurs here above this theater. They say that sometimes one of the hands on the wall facing south in particular will stop moving, but that later in the evening, a shadowy apparition will show itself, gently taking hold of the big hand on the tower and moving it to its correct position before disappearing again, as if he's taking pride in his work from far beyond the grave. Also, since I already justified why we're in Bakersfield, I might as well include another place here. Although I'll admit this one is concise, but I love haunted public places, places that are supposedly haunted that you can visit yourself without having to pay a fee or break any laws. In Bakersfield, Mill Creek Park falls into this category. Mill Creek Park is a quaint creekside park in Bakersfield that's downtown of the city, just at the intersection of Mill Creek Road and 19th Street. It's one of the oldest parks in the area, and was actually developed in the early 1900s. I wish there was more interesting history to say about it, but it seems quaint and nice and distinctly not the sort of place you'd expect to find a ghost, which is perhaps why it catches so many people off guard. Here, they say, some who travel to the city of Bakersfield late at night and pass by this park see something odd, though. They say that as they pass by, usually in their cars, they occasionally see a semi-translucent, yet sort of glowing white woman, wearing a long flowing dress, walking over the bridge from its west to east side, and sort of fading away as she passes over the threshold on its east side. As for who this woman is, well, there's little speculation, even online, and there weren't any well-known or notorious passings in the area, so I can only imagine this individual was someone who passed locally, and that she's reliving one of the better, or perhaps the worst, days of her life in the afterlife. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this trek through some of Southern California's strangeness. I had a blast myself, and I'm excited to circle back soon for some of your weird folklore, and maybe a Dark Places video on Hollywood. All of that said, if you did like this video, a like, a comment, a hype, and your subscription will always be free, and it'll help support this channel so I can make more and better content. It'll never cost a dime, promise. Next up, of course, it's the season of spirits, so we're talking about more hauntings, and we'll be talking about Vermont's haunted places, so get ready for that. And finally, whether your professor at college just let you know he'd love to do some research with you on life after death, or if you just heard a rock concert coming from an empty hotel room next to yours, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.